what you believe is what you think God believes. And it's just utterly brilliant research. They manipulated
Wow.
they manipulated your belief, and basically it was, if you changed your mind on a subject, lo and behold, God changed his mind as well. And
Wow.
it's just a fascinating study that shows
Yes.
that what we think God thinks or believes is a projection of our thoughts and beliefs.
That is a fun intro. Yeah.
Thanks. Okay, that took me, I kid you not, that took me like 5.5 hours.
Oh, I was gonna guess much more than that. Like, that's
Yeah.
impressive work.
It took-
Yeah, well done.
I think total, if I had to count like collecting all the clips
Yeah,
and
yeah.
things like that, probably a lot more. But the actual putting everything
Putting it
together,
Yeah.
very long time.
Yes,
Very long
I
time.
believe that. Like, that
Oh.
was, I know what goes into that kind of thing. It's like, well
Yes.
done.
So you liked it? You felt honored by that? You feel like it's
You
worth
see me
okay,
dancing?
cool.
I was up here
Yeah.
dancing. Love
Yeah,
it.
I wanted to make sure that you felt like we're going hard for Dr. Bird. Like we're throwing it down. I love it. I bet you've never had a theme song like that, huh?
Nice. Oh, well, so, I mean, full disclosure, David McDonald made me a personal theme song,
And his are good, actually. His are top tier. So I mean,
for one of our streams, I actually sent him this song, and I said, "You need to play this the next time I'm on your show." And he's like, "Oh yeah."
done. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, listen, if I gotta be second to anybody, I'm glad it's David McDonald over at Deep Drinks. Everybody go check out after this, not during this.
Yeah.
David McDonald on Deep Drinks.
What's the longest you've gone without sleep? I love that you don't know.
I don't.
I respect that.
Listen.
You gotta think about that.
Listen, I have a past.
Yep, I can tell already.
Almost. I want to say almost 72 hours.
Ooh.
Could be 72, but I don't think so.
So I first found out about you on the Freedom from Religion Honorary Board. That's where I kind of first stumbled upon your name, and then I started looking up your work. And I was just so curious about which came first. Was it your love for sciences that led you to the freedom from religion and atheism and agnosticism? Or was it that you first felt that separation from religion and then decided to pursue science?
I don't think it was in order. I think it was parallel. I think as a kid, I'm going to guess maybe around 11 or 12. So I was raised around plenty of religion. Family was Catholic. My father actually wrote music for the Catholic Church, had a lot of, family, friends and acquaintances and things like that. People of very deep faith. At the same time, as a little kid, I'm figuring out, what do I like? What am I good at? Turns out I really like going out in the woods and flipping over logs and finding, salamanders or catching frogs and things like this. So my interest in biology and nature was kind of just something separate and parallel. And then you think, but I do think it was sometime around that age that, it just never landed with me, sort of religious, instruction or education or things like that, I'm looking back on it now from a long time ago, but I've thought about this a lot, and I had sort of a second wave of exposure, because I actually I went to a secular middle school, but I went to a Catholic high school. So,
oh, interesting.
Kind of re-immersed, and I'd never gone to Catholic schools before that. So I was already, let's just say, skeptical.
Yeah.
By the time I entered high school, which made a new school an interesting experience.
Yeah, for sure. For sure.
And so I think, I think and think back to that time that I was pretty, I just sort of felt like, whatever these people were talking about and how they had been impacted and their sense of faith, I didn't have those feelings. And I just thought, well, I don't know, it's kind of like the arrow missed me, it's just like I wasn't inclined in that direction in some way. And so the science interest was really just parallel to that. I think, later as both a professional scientist and a scholar, you start trying to, wrestle this. And really, I should tell you, like in Catholic high school, say, for example, the subject of evolution, I didn't know there was any fuss. I was taught evolution just straight up. And I didn't know until I got out of high school that there were people that struggled with evolution. So anyway, that's a bit of a wander, but it wasn't a 1-2 thing. I think it was just sort of parallel. Like, if I had been better at baseball, I would have been a baseball player. Okay.
Right.
I was interested in nature and critters and just the religious angle, because I was exposed a lot in the home and, in school, in high school, I had plenty of chances to sort of absorb this and make it sort of part of my outlook. And it just, again, I've described it often as like, I think it just didn't take,
Yeah. I think that's a really good way to put it. I feel like there's a certain age where a lot of religious people, I grew up Southern Baptist. I think there's a certain age where it's not that you start to argue necessarily, you just start to question the things that don't make sense, because on one hand you're learning about things like evolution and science and how the planet came to be, and then on the other hand you're hearing stories that tell you the complete opposite, or they don't necessarily add up. And so I think that's a good way to put it. I think that's a really
it does sort of
way.
That is probably the germ of against that sort of skeptical thinking of just sort of like, really, is that, and then probably if you catch, I was thinking about this a little bit. I don't know if you saw the HBO series on George Carlin the other day.
Yeah. I've seen clips. I haven't seen the whole thing.
Yeah. So I'm thinking back about that same time as when I got my first George Carlin album. And he I think it was Class Clown, where he's talking about all the shenanigans they were up to in school in Catholic school and things like this. And then I learned that there were sort of people that kind of gave you permission to, or maybe a roadmap to sort of, act up and sort of ask a lot of questions, but to try to do it with sort of good humor, right? Not as, not in a nasty way, but sort of like, really?
Yep.
Maybe that's the birth of sort of, sort of Carlin's sort of humor, and probably, Monty Python humor, which you start seeing on American airwaves about that time. And sort of the way they're also asking questions and, poking a little fun at least political establishment and things like that. And those things start to seep in your head as a kid. And it's like, hey, wait a second. All the grownups don't believe all this stuff that you're hearing. It's not like, it's not like everybody believes the same stuff. No, they don't. So there's room in here to kind of think your own way. And that was just very appealing to me, that to have the chance to sort of figure it out for myself.
Yeah. It's like, first you listen to George Carlin, then you watch Life of Brian, and it's all downhill from there. There's no coming back.
It certainly did shape my taste in comedy, that's for sure.
So speaking of comedy, you had mentioned that you had written a piece around comedy, and I would love to kind of just hear what you had to say.
Well, a recent book I wrote it's called A Series of Fortunate Events, and it looks at the role of chance in the making of the planet, in the making of life, in the making of us as individuals. And chance is another slippery subject for certain theologies, because certain theologies that want things to sort of want events to be controlled or designed. Chance is sort of, the opposite of that thinking. And as I was sort of wrapping up this book, which I think has a certain lightheartedness to it. I mean, the science is serious, but I try to, tell it through stories and again, have a little bit of a humorous bent. But I thought about how many comedians I knew, and that would be, back to George Carlin, or, Sarah Silverman, or Bill Maher, or Ricky Gervais, or Bill Burr, or you can go back, or writers like Kurt Vonnegut. I liked, as a kid, again, I probably discovered Vonnegut about that same age. And Vonnegut sort of also was winking at you like, hey, the grownups, they don't know what they're talking about.
Right.
Go ahead, think for yourself, kid.
Yeah.
Was a strong message in Vonnegut. And I thought all these folks brought up religion in their acts or in their work. And I always thought that was kind of dangerous, especially think about our culture today, which is, if you bring up something that people might find, that's so dear to their identity, then, there's a risk that you're going to be, canceled, ostracized, whatever.
Yep.
But again, all these comedians were doing it, and likewise with Monty Python and things like that. And so I thought, why was this such common subject matter for all these comedians who I really liked?
Yeah.
There may be a relationship there as to why I liked them. And so I read a lot of interviews, but in writing the book, I reached out, for example, to Eric Idle, and generous guy responded.
That's awesome. That's so cool.
And he really hit a note that then I found again and again and again in interviews or writings or by various comedians as truth tellers. And you sort, and I don't know why I had, it took me a long time to sort of put these dots together, but as truth tellers, when you sort of think a comedian is often sort of creating some situation that's made up to get a yuck or something like this.
Yeah.
But no, in this area, of course, they were sort of holding up a mirror, and the idea was to show you a bit of truth. And of course, if it's done with some finesse and you get a chuckle out of it, it kind of makes the medicine go down. It's a little easier to talk about these subjects, or to use, as Vonnegut did, things like science fiction or things like this to sort of hold up a mirror and go, really, folks, are you so darn sure that this is exactly how things are?
Yeah.
So anyway, I just really enjoy. To me, that sort of came as an insight. And I thought, the two groups of people who seem, in this case, least inclined to think that everything happens for a reason in the world, are scientists and comedians. I thought, what do scientists and comedians have in common?
Right.
And I arrived at that after sort of consulting Eric Idle and other comedians. So to me, that was just a nice, a pleasing insight. Truth telling sounds like it's a noble quality. We scientists certainly like to think that we are in pursuit of the truth and try to give the truth the best we can.
Right.
I didn't really ever think of comedians as truth tellers until that was the insight. I thought, and that's sort of makes comedy work, because this was pointed out by other comedians. Often a joke has an element of truth to it. We recognize the element of truth, and it may be juxtaposed against some absurdity or whatever. But often, we're making fun of our own foibles as humans. Right?
Exactly.
And we're like, oh yeah, we are like we are. And the best comedians are able to both get an idea across and have you chuckle at it. And I think that was a big message to me as a scientist, that we scientists are often trying to, it's like, if you just had the information that was in our heads, so this is what we're trying to do all the time, is say, let me share my knowledge with you. But you look at comedian style and the fact that they're able to talk about serious subjects while entertaining people. I thought, well, goodness, that's a page I should take right out of their playbook and try to be, a more interesting and entertaining speaker or conversationalist.
Yeah, absolutely. And as a comedian myself, I absolutely recognize the difference between when you tell somebody a fact. A lot of times they're like, no, that's not the case, blah, blah, blah. That's not what I'm about, or that's not how we are. But as a comedian, if you make a joke about it, especially if you include your own personal self-deprecation, if you make that joke like, we do this, don't we? People are like, yeah, we do. And it's the exact same fact, or it's the exact same, accusation. But for whatever reason, when somebody presents it in science, it gets rejected or it gets questioned. And when somebody presents it with humor, it gets accepted, and people are just like, yeah, I guess that's what we do.
Yeah. So I think, from a viewpoint of storytelling or, and humor or other forms of sort of entertainment that people like, novels, of course, these are the, various arts allow you to sort of wrap these serious issues in something that it just makes them, the exploration of them more palatable than just, a scientist coming out and saying, well, you have no evidence for that. That's kind of the end of the discussion, right?
Yeah.
Not much fun in that at all. So.
Right. Is there a particular subject or focus that you think is very, very important to get across to people, whether it's evolution or anything else that you're like, I just really wish people would like agree with this and absorb this if they learn nothing else?
Well, again, I've had lots of discussions over the decades, right? And as an evolutionary biologist, I've certainly run into resistance, either in the classroom or on campuses or whatever about evolution. I guess, look, I'd like to think that I've gained some wisdom over the years of where that comes from. People are raised differently. You were raised differently. Certain things you were not exposed to, or maybe you were told some things were out of bounds and or that they were actually being propagated by people that had, malicious intentions and things like that. So you understand people, it's a big country, big world. People are raised differently. I guess just you lament as a scientist that if that closes people off to either hearing specifically what scientists might be able to share about the world, or even generally, you're missing out on something. The ability to kind of, just in the last 50 or 60 years, the things we've learned. I'll give you an example. One of my favorite stories. When first discovered, actually, the scientific community had difficulty believing it, but I think now it's probably widely recognized in the popular culture that the Earth was hit by an asteroid 66 million years ago. This asteroid really changed the course of life on the planet. The evidence for that asteroid is all over the planet. I've been to many sites myself where you can basically pick up fallout material and point to the boundary and all this kind of stuff. And we know that, dinosaurs go right up to that fallout boundary and none afterwards, right?
Right.
So this really pivotal event in sort of the story of life on Earth, we didn't know that in the 1970s. The evidence for that was published in 1980. And as I said, it took probably about 10 years for the scientific community to sort of fully accept it, because you kind of needed other pieces of evidence to feel really persuaded.
Right.
And I sort of think, gosh, if I can't interest you with asteroids and dinosaurs, what shot do I have with, with other pieces of biology, right? There's not much better stuff than that. So I just think I just lament if people close themselves off and feel that somehow science is, either, an opponent to them or something to be, kind of swept aside. It's too bad, because in terms of a role in our culture, science has grown ever more powerful in its tools and its sort of perception. Just as I said, just in the last 40 or 50 years, things that we've learned are really kind of awesome and striking and powerful.
Right. About
how the world works, about how nature, pieces of nature work, about how our own bodies work, things like this. And it's sad to me if people feel they can't go near that, or people feel their children can't go near that,
right,
in classrooms and things like that. Because I think they're missing out on part of, Earth's story and the human story and things like this.
Yeah. You're like, stegosauruses are all I've got. Like, if that doesn't entice you, then I don't know what else.
Exactly. But it may be a slippery slope, because once you start talking about dinosaurs, and then, the mammals really took off when the dinosaurs were gone, and eventually that gets you to primates, and eventually that gets you to humans. That's a narrative that for certain folks, none of that works.
The buck stops here.
Yeah.
Do you, I've always wondered, do you find that, and I don't know exactly how much time you've spent internationally, but do you find that your ideas and your findings and your teachings are accepted any more overseas than in America? Tell me about that.
The climate here in the US is distinctly different. So across, Europe has a really big scientific community. So probably the one place I've spent the most time, was just there a couple of weeks ago, is Europe. And, they're just, take some place like England, right? Really much of the industrial and scientific revolution came out of England and Scotland. And, really the rethinking about the planet, about life, lots of discoveries, lots of great thinkers came from there. And it's sort of baked into their culture. These are the people, Darwin's is buried at Westminster Abbey, for goodness sake, right?
Yeah.
And I think also in their media, in their mass media, as kids grow up, they're exposed to all this as sort of with pride, the great thinkers and scientists of Britain. And we just don't have that tradition. And, whatever the numbers may be, I've always thought it's perhaps 25 or 30% of the country, wouldn't embrace, for example, evolutionary science in the way that it's embraced in other parts of the world. And so there's just part of American society that feels cut off from, that narrative of, how we understand life, to be.
Right. Absolutely. And I feel like also there is a protection of religion in the United States that doesn't seem to exist anywhere else, with the exception of maybe parts of the Middle East. I feel like there is something about America that makes the religious, what's the word I'm looking for? Like the religious temperature in America seems to be that an unseen force is attacking religious people, and they have to fight with all their might to protect it, even if that means ignoring science, even if that means ignoring, health and discoveries and beneficial things for your life. If it comes into contact with your religious beliefs and they don't line up, religion has to come first.
Yeah, I mean, I think pretty much often in any kind of duel between God and science, for many people, God's going to come first, or your interpretation of what that means is going to come first. That's sure. Well, first of course, freedom of religion is enshrined in our Constitution, at least in the Bill of Rights. And that means that sometimes if people feel that freedom is infringed, say in public schools, they've pushed back against what is in, what's being taught in schools. Now, that's been generally held up. It's been held up in the Supreme Court that, of course, the teaching of evolution is appropriate in public schools,
right?
And that the opposition to it being religiously motivated, it would be inappropriate because of the Establishment Clause of the Constitution to favor one group, to favor a religious perspective. Nonetheless, because, certainly historically, presently it seems that maybe younger generations are a little less religious than previous generations, but historically, with a very large, Christian population in the United States, and in our history, a lot of people came to the U.S. and started, various splits of branches of the Protestant religions, really in reaction to what was happening in Europe. That Europe was too liberal in the 19th century, for example, and that gave us lots of various strains of Protestantism in the United States. So the idea that this was, a place where people could pursue their religious freedom, and they were, in some cases, pursuing it in opposition to what was perceived as liberalization in Europe. That's part of our history. That's part of our fiber, and so that's why I think that's some of the explanation why. And you have this regional differences in sort of the both which strands of Protestantism are most practiced and what that means in terms of people's behavior and outlooks. We're a big country with with not as long a history, and of course we're a young country, but still this has been going on long enough that there are certain trends that that are pretty obvious to people, and it is very different from Europe. Which makes my European colleagues sort of. It's more than 50 times I've been asked, "Hey, Sean, what's going on over there?" And we start to have these discussions about, sort of the history of the U.S. and how it was settled, and how religious freedom has been handled, and challenges in public schools and things like that.
Right. And I can think of, off the top of my head, maybe 2 countries that were founded by people who either were rejected from their own country or left their own country specifically for the pursuit of their religious beliefs. And I think that is, like, as you mentioned, one of the core foundations of why we are this. The rest of the world probably views us as a little bit of fanaticists, because there are so few countries that started that way. And so there's that inherent need to just surround and protect at all costs.
But of course, interesting being also the unique country where the whole world has, emigrated.
Yeah.
Right? It's like, but we've got everybody here with all sorts of, which is a darn good reason to have freedom of religion, because that
Absolutely.
freedom is also what not just the freedom to be, more in reaction, but freedom whether you were going to be religious or not. The fact
Right.
that all creeds or no creed was, we're welcome in the country. On the one hand, that's a really important beacon, and that's drawn, of course, such strength, so much strength of the country is drawn from
Absolutely.
people that have come here, for all sorts of reasons, but that sort of diversity came with them.
Absolutely. And I feel like the best way to learn and to kind of expand your knowledge is to surround yourself with people like that, who think the complete opposite of you or who believe the complete opposite of you. And so it's this, I don't want to say double-edged sword, but it's this interesting dichotomy that we have in this country where you can believe whatever you want to believe. You can come here and you are welcome to pray to whoever you want to pray. If you want to pray at all, you're welcome to be a Scientologist or Muslim or Baptist or Catholic or whatever you want. And then at the same time, we also have such a heavy hand with Christianity in our laws. So it's, on one hand, we're saying, believe whatever you want. And then on the other hand, it's a little bit difficult sometimes to believe whatever you want, depending on where you are.
It's the majority
Yeah.
denomination for sure. Although, of course, big differences within those denominations. But I'll mention something. We're of a little bit different generation, Sydney. I think I'm just going to take a guess that we have a little bit different generations. Growing up, and I grew up in kind of a mixed blue, white collar neighborhood in Ohio, in a city in Ohio. Three things we never talked about. We never talked about, families or households, never talked about who they voted for.
Yep.
You didn't talk about your religious differences. People went off on Sunday or Saturday to wherever they went, and you didn't talk about how much money you made.
Yes.
And I think and when I say not talking, one might say, well, not talking, that's not good either. But I mean, sort of like saying respecting the privacy.
Right.
And the differences that exist among people. And that,
Right.
If you went house to house, I don't know, best friends are Lutheran, Catholic, Methodist, United Church of Christ, Jewish in school. I mean, what do you do with that? You're like, well, everybody's whatever they are, and there you go. And people are going to vote differently, or your parents are going to vote differently, is the case. I'm just kind of talking about kids' impressions of the world.
Right.
And then, you don't talk about who makes how much, my parent makes more than your parent. I mean, that's an open invitation to trouble.
That's a fist
So there
fight
was,
waiting
I
to
think,
happen.
a lot of wisdom that sort of the social mores of the time was that it was impolite.
Right.
To sort of you could say, it's not like you would hide. You didn't hide that, you were active in the Lutheran church or something, but it just wasn't differences among people weren't emphasized. It was just let it be. And, I've seen a sea change in, wow. Talking about who you vote for, my God, this has become, the ultimate identity question. And then,
right.
And because, and look how divisive that is. And, religion, it can be a source of conflict and tension there.
Yeah.
And I don't know what to say about money. Everybody's thinking about money, I guess. So, but tax the rich, eat the rich. I don't know what it stands for, but this is, in a country that has such people of so many different backgrounds who got here for so many different reasons. There was a certain wisdom in that. And if you play up these distinctions, then you are drawing divisions. And I think we're all feeling some remorse that's where things have gone.
Yeah, I was about to ask you, do you think it would be almost beneficial to have it the way that it used to be? Because I remember even when I was a kid, it was like, don't ask about money, don't ask about religion, don't ask about like that sort of thing. Do you almost think like we would benefit from kind of that social behavior? Or
I feel saying that, I feel like such the old guy going, well, kids, back in my day, we didn't do that. I'm certainly not the first person to say, lots of people have made this sort of comment. I think, I suspect because I have friends of all sorts of, stripes, and colleagues of all sorts of stripes that, mostly there seems to be a pretty noisy faction over here and a pretty noisy faction over there, and that most people would rather kind of be in the middle and turn the noise down.
Yeah.
But we don't seem to be we haven't sort of figured out how to get there. So, but I want to go back. I just want to point to something that you said about, you think it's best to go out and talk to people who actually have different viewpoints. 1,000%. This is so important. And I'm very, very worried. So, I've been an academic all my life. I'm very worried that this is even something that academia, where university campuses, which was the place where this was going to happen, if you go to college, if you go to a 4-year college or a two-year college, you go there and you have the chance to blend with people of different backgrounds, around professors that, know things about history and religion and sociology and science and all these sorts of things. And if we don't embrace those diversity of viewpoints, what do we get? And if we don't encourage the diversity of viewpoints, so I think that, you've probably read about this or heard about this in various ways, or maybe you've experienced it, but it's actually alarming to me that we've reached this point where certain viewpoints are deemed unhearable, that they are, can't be listened to. And that puts you on such a slippery slope of, censorship and closed-mindedness and actually sort of, excluding people who have something to contribute, and also excluding them based on their view on one particular issue. They're now, ostracized or whatever, and you're just going to ignore all the complexity of whatever they may have to think about 19 other issues. I mean, you're banned on the basis of a viewpoint about one particular issue, which of course is an issue, issue around which there may not be consensus or unanimity. And for that to be happening on campuses is terribly alarming.
Absolutely. I tell people all the time, the most I feel like I ever grew as an intellectual, as a person, as just entirely as a human being, was when I was in college. I was in debate for many years. And I was in a forum called IPDA, which means you find out who your partner is going to be right before the round. You find out what the topic is going to be right before the round, and you find out what side you're going to be right before the round. And you are forced to do research, even if you're on a side that you would never be in real life. You are forced for that half hour to do research to support the opposite of what it is you personally believe. And I learned so much about who I actually was, what I actually thought, because I remember I was one of those young, 19, 21-year-olds who just thought I knew everything. And all it took was the right amount of people asking me why about my strongest opinions for me to be like, my brain to short circuit and be like, wait, why do I think that? I was told that by somebody, wasn't I? Like, isn't that the right way to think? And I feel like even if, say, for example, you are Catholic or Muslim or something like that, even if you do all the research and you read every religious text there is and you speak to people from all different religions, even if at the end of the day you are still exactly where you were to begin with, at least now you know why. At least now you know, I believe this, I believe this, I don't believe this, I don't believe that. And I feel like that should belong in all aspects. That should belong in politics, in religion, in any belief system, even in social issues. And I think I don't want to lose that. And I never want to live in a society where everybody is exactly like me, because then you don't learn anything.
No, now you don't learn anything. I don't think those societies function very well.
No.
They're not really in a good position to handle change or, difference in the outside world.
Right.
No, absolutely. And I think even, whatever that exploration, wherever it leads you, you're going to certainly have insight into others, maybe empathy. And, probably one of the most important human characteristics is our ability to have empathy for others, regardless of our differences, right? We can cheer or cry at the fate or experiences of a fellow human being whom we've never met, will never know, may even be fictional.
Yeah.
And that's what we, that's what we need to sort of get by and, and as a group, in the world. And so I think that's sort of the, the enlightened approach, and walling ourselves off from others, and just not hearing, not seeing. That's just it's a very limited way to live.
Yeah. Do you remember, maybe this was when you were younger, maybe it was recently, do you ever remember a time where you made a statement or you said something and somebody called you out on it, and it wasn't until that moment where you were like, oh, that was kind of an offhanded or small-minded thing?
Yeah, no, I think part of my baggage was I sort of had to kind of fight my way out of Catholicism.
Yeah, I would love to hear about that.
At least argue my way out of it.
Yeah.
Because it was considered sort of, the default state. It was how I was raised, and I found myself in a school. So I had to explain why things didn't add up for me, and why I did not want to be asked to go through certain sort of, rituals and perform, and participate in certain things, because I just didn't believe in what I was doing. I had to articulate that, and to do it in a way to adults that was, constructive, respectful, or whatever. You're not just going to always have those tools as a 14-year-old, right? No, because you're just like, now later, I think the biggest mistake that, I'll just say folks like me, whatever that means, we don't know who folks are that are like me.
Yeah.
Is that when you think you're in the company of people that sort of all think the same way, you can throw off some stray voltage that might be critical of something, and like, it could be a little harsh.
Yeah.
It could be a little harsh. And then that harsh might mean, especially if somebody feels a bit wounded by it in their presence, then you're sort of like, that was,
yeah.
It was just clumsy, it was clumsy and not thoughtful to do that. And you understand, then you end up sort of backing up, and it's a good experience to go through, but also sort of teaches you, hey, don't throw stones if you don't have to.
Yeah.
There's more constructive. Now it's funny, anybody who sees or hears this interview and knows me is going to think, what do you mean, Sean, not throwing stones? But I think I've become more sensitive to the things that they're just deeper for people, right?
Yeah.
So, science is like, it's an intellectual contact sport. Okay.
Yes.
We argue with each other all the time. Now, you have to do it in such a way, of course, that you don't destroy personal relationships.
Right.
But you got to have kind of a thick skin, because often our initial, something I interpret in my lab or something like that, if the first impression you may be off, and you don't come out going, I have it figured out. You're like, hey, I'm trying to figure this out. And there's a back and forth and a back and forth and a back and forth. And, it's, when I say a contact sport, well, just like other sport, it's an enjoyable contact sport if you play fair.
Yeah.
And you're, not mean-spirited or a bully or things like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that develops a certain skill sort of and mindset. But if you take that experience as a scientist into certain other settings, and you think others are up for that level,
no,
yeah, on other topics, you're like, no, wait a second, you're a little, somebody like me might be too intense a debater, too ready to examine everything, sort of figure, in science, everything's fair game.
Right.
It's fair game because it's evidence driven. You got to say, is that consistent? Is that consistent? Is that consistent? Well, you get into, like social issues, you're at a barbecue or something like that.
Right.
Hey, simmer down, buddy. This is, we're just at a barbecue. We're not trying to settle a grand scientific question here.
Right.
So
right.
Sometimes
Absolutely.
you gotta kind of change your mindset. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I was just talking to somebody the other day about that, about how you can be I tell my students all the time when I teach stand-up classes, everybody thinks they want to be roasted until they get roasted, and then it's not so fun anymore. And you can, when you're in like a science environment, or when you're in an intellectual environment or a debate environment, and you are arguing with people and you're asking them to bring up evidence and you're asking them where they got their facts, they're going to come right back at you. But if you do it in a social environment, you might cause people to think about things they've never thought about before. And that can cause trauma. That can cause literal, they can question their entire existence in that moment. And that's a little too much for some people.
That's a little too much. And I think also people can feel judged.
Yes.
And, look, you have that experience as a debater, right? So if you're used to, and you can argue either side of an argument, which is also how law school is taught, right? They can argue either side of an argument. If you're used to that and you just kind of reflexively deploy it, it's worked for you, right? It's worked for you in life this far. It's worked for me in life this far.
Yeah.
But you can deploy it in certain settings, and it does not land well. And so being a bit mindful of that.
Right.
At the same time, if what you're hearing is just absolute garbage,
nonsense,
it's pretty hard to bite your tongue for very long.
Yeah. Or you let out that laugh that you don't mean to let out, and you're like,
exactly.
oh, yeah,
really, yeah.
And one of my favorite sports of all time, and I was just talking about this like 2 nights ago, one of my favorite things to do, maybe it makes me evil, I don't know, is when somebody starts to go off on a rant or a tangent about something that they don't know applies to me, and I don't stop them, and I don't tell them that it applies to me, and I just let them keep going, because I want to see how far they're going to take this, whether it's, I don't know, whether it's about Southerners, because I spent 13 years in Chicago. So especially in like 2016 and 2017, they would just go off on like Southerners and how they're this and how they're that, and how like people from the South are this and they're all these. And I just love letting them go off without saying a word.
Let them dig that hole.
And then at the very end, revealing that and watching them backpedal as fast as they possibly can. And you're like, no, you said it. I caught you. You said it. I have it. It's right here. But maybe that's evil. I don't know.
A big difference here is that the jury, what we used to call the peanut gallery, usually the peanut gallery was within earshot of your voice.
Right.
Now, of course, with social media, the peanut gallery is infinite.
Yeah.
Peanut gallery is ready to judge. And goodness knows what this has done to discourse.
Right.
On the one hand, you can find more voices out there.
True.
On the other hand, fill in the blank. So I don't have a take on this. I just wonder what having that larger audience, and of course an audience that doesn't necessarily know people personally, and the like dislike button is just not something that I'm really keen about.
Right. Yeah. And have you found that in your pursuit of like genetics and science and biology, have you found that has that hampered or hindered in any way your relationship with people that you met through, say, religion, or that you knew who were religious? Has that changed your relationship with people at all? Or
you mean my experience in biology, has that changed my relationship with religious people?
Like as you began to like pursue sciences more, did you find that people you knew that were religious were like pulling away from you, or did it?
No, I don't think I don't think that happened. I don't, for example, if most of the people I knew were Catholic or, as I said, sort of, I'm thinking maybe Lutheran, Episcopalian, this kind of thing. There's just not a big deal there. I didn't know many, for example, I didn't know any Christian fundamentalists that I grew up with. Just wasn't prevalent where I grew up. That would, of course, been a little more awkward, probably, as I, came back and visited old friends. In fact, probably the other thing that happened was that, as I was telling you earlier, that I felt I sort of had to fight my way out of Catholicism, because that was the expected default state of where I was going to be. So as a teenager, I had to develop these tools of trying to, extricate myself, but do it in a way that adults would accept. That still leaves a sort of a mark, I think. Probably put a little chip on my shoulder of, hey, why was that so hard? Why it would have been nicer to just sort of, kind of leave it blank and let me fill in the blank and see what happens. Instead, I had to kind of actively work my way out. And I think that left me understanding that for a lot of people, that's the default state, that they are brought up, they're expected to join the religion they're brought up in and to embrace that and perhaps pass that on to their kids. So being sensitized by that, not sensitive, not in a positive way, but sensitive by that. I think it took me a while to sort of be able to make peace over things like evolutionary science and things. And actually a really, really influential person is a woman named Jeannie Scott, who led an organization called the National Center for Science Education. And I learned from her that her best allies, she went around the country, especially dealing with opposition against evolution and sometimes joining in court cases and talking to school boards and things like this. Her best allies were clergy.
Interesting.
And because if you stand in front of a school board and you stand in front of a judge and your allies are clergy, and the clergy are saying, oh, wait, the teaching of evolution is straightforward, and religion doesn't belong in public school. So, let's leave that up to us on Saturdays and Sundays. And a judge hears that, it's like, oh, yeah, that's how it goes. Whereas if you just had a bunch of, upset scientists going, but evolution is the right thing, what's a judge to do? So she really taught all of us about the power of alliances, common ground with, for example, clergy. And so, I've sort of sought that. So, when you reached out and said, well, I come on your podcast, I inferred something from the name of the podcast that perhaps something you had, a journey you had been on out of.
Yeah.
But even if you said, I'm a practicing fundamentalist, Southern Baptist, et cetera, would you talk to me? I would say, oh, heck yes. The best chance we have of kind of making progress is talking to people who don't think alike.
Yes.
Right.
Absolutely.
So sure, we'll have a conversation, and there may be maybe things upon which we disagree, and that's fine.
Yeah.
That's perfectly fine. It's not, this does not determine whether you're a good or a bad person or anything like that.
No.
It's just the way it is.
Yeah. And it's the way that you treat people with those beliefs, because you can be fundamentalist, you can be entirely agnostic or atheist, and in either scenario, if you're an asshole, you're an asshole. And in either scenario, that's
its own tribe right there. Yes,
right.
That's right.
Right. Like assholes exist everywhere.
They do. Yeah.
But at the same time, like, especially through this podcast, I have interviewed a lot of people who are still very religious. Some of them were even preachers and pastors. And I have been so surprised by their opinion on certain things. Even now, even this far into my journey, having spoken to so many people, I found that I still had biases that didn't apply to them. And so I feel like there's always that just like I imagine science is a subject that is always changing and always including more and excluding more, and maybe one day you think one thing and the next day you read a study that proves another thing. I feel like us as people are the same way. We will always, if we seek it, we will always continue to learn more and grow by talking to people who are different than us. And you might find that people who are different than you actually aren't that much different than you at all, but maybe in the ways that matter.
Yeah, and I think you can make the pact to agree to disagree on certain things.
Yeah.
Identify probably why you got there, and for goodness sake, and especially these days, find some things to agree upon. I'll pick something between, I think, science and communities of faith that I think they could find a lot of common ground on, and that's really the future of life on the planet. You can come at it from a scientific point of view. You could sit there and say, well, gosh, we've lost 2/3 of the wildlife on this planet in numbers in just the last 50 years. Mm-hmm. The world is getting diminished, right? There's less variety and beauty out there than there used to be. And I think if you come at it from a religious perspective, as many religious leaders and writers and speakers have, is to say, well, wait a second, we're failing in sort of the meaning of our time on Earth, which is, we can't leave an impoverished planet to the next generation. This is not, it's not morally right. It's not ethically right. It's, if you take it in the sense of this is the world, that's the act of a creator, we are destroying the creator's work, So even you might not quite have the same reasons, you can at least agree on the common cause that this is concern to humanity, that we need community leaders, we need people who, like faith leaders, who are trusted messengers to their communities. We need scientists who might have constructive ideas about how we can restore some of what's been lost. And we join and we make common cause. Those groups making common cause might not agree on other social issues.
Right.
So what? That's just going to be a fact of life all the time. I'm a Red Sox fan. You might be a White Sox or a Cubs fan. Who knows? We're not going to agree on certain things.
Right.
But these important things that we can find common cause, let's join forces for the common good. And it's just really disappointing. There's just so little narrative or evidence of that out there, and certainly in our political systems and sort of on the airwaves. But I think it's something that people in their hearts, they really, really are thirsty for right now.
Right. And even if you think of the most fundamentalist, like I hate to use the term crazy, but like what people might label like craziest faith-based people you've ever thought of, even they, the ones who like picket funerals and things like that, even they preach what they preach because they insist that if you do the bad things, it will end life on Earth or it will destroy. So even the ones that are so far out that people of the same religion are like, we don't associate with them, even they agree that it is a bad thing that we don't continue to have like life and existence for the generations beyond us. And I think that's really interesting. Very interesting.
I think that this is I think I don't know. I can't criticize political leaders because I don't know what that life is like. It seems like a miserable.
You could not pay me enough.
A miserable road to hoe. But we just don't seem to have much flavor of that in our national discourse right now. What can we agree upon? How can we act on these sorts of priorities? And you can just come at it from all sorts of ways. There's a book called The Good Ancestor, just a book I read in the last few months. And I thought it's a nice way to reframe it, asking the question, are we being good ancestors? That the 7 or 8 billion people are alive today, we're going to be followed by tens and tens and tens of billions of people who are going to inherit the world that we have shaped kind of disproportionately, right? Are we being good ancestors to much larger numbers of people that will follow us in the way that we're taking care of the planet? And that just, I think you ask that question in any audience, right? It doesn't matter what political stripe, religious stripe, what your training is or anything like that. That's a good moral human question to ask.
That is.
Are we being good ancestors? And if the answer is, well, maybe not, then you might ask, well, what would make us better ancestors to future generations? And, what's that take? And there's, of course, not going to be easy answers to that. Or easy answers, we already would have done it.
Yeah.
So I think sometimes we just need a new narrative, a new, kind of a new mindset to join forces on.
Yeah, that's a really good way to put it. Are we being good ancestors? I think the answer is no for a lot of people. And I think they wouldn't realize that until they thought about that.
I think there's very strong evidence that at the same time, I don't think we should, we also have to make sure we don't beat ourselves up so much,
right,
or to paralyze ourselves, or that we speak so much in terms of gloom and doom,
right,
that people give up, that it's hopeless and pessimistic, et cetera. Because I actually would say it's not the case that it's hopeless. I have plenty of evidence that it's time to change the road we're on, but the sooner the better.
Yeah, you can always start today. Today is always a good time to start. I read something the other day where this person tweeted, I don't know who needs to know this, but you don't have to start something at 05 or 10 or 15. You can start at 13 or 11. You can start anytime you want, no matter what the task is. And I feel like today is the perfect day to start that. 2 last questions for you.
Sure.
First, where can we find your work? And 2, when are you going to start stand-up? When are you going to start comedy?
What am I? No, I'm just going to be a fan of. Maybe I should take the second one first. The second one first. So I'm a huge fan of stand-up.
Yeah.
So the question is, where am I going to see you doing stand-up? And I'll come and introduce myself.
There you go. There you go.
All right.
Get some
So
stage time.
I'll keep it. Well, I don't want any stage time. I'll
Oh,
introduce you on the side. I'll catch it between sets.
Yeah.
I'm just a big fan of stand-up, and actually, I go here in DC. I have kids that live in LA, and I'm in the habit of going both here and there, and of course watching stuff on TV. I guess again, because also you get a whole variety of, perspectives coming out there, and you get different kinds of jokes. I love people who can write, rapid one-liners. I'll take somebody like a Jim Gaffigan, but I also love storytellers that unpack a long story with a few punches. So big fan of stand-up. Okay, now we'll come around the other way. You said, where can you read my work? So I've written several books for the general public. So if you just look up Sean, so I have a personal website, Sean B. Carroll, which will lead you to those books, or you can look it up on Amazon or whatever. So the most recent book is called A Series of Fortunate Events, and that's the role of chance in sort of the awe-inspiring sense of just how unlikely it is that we're even here, or that you and I are even having this conversation. And before that, I wrote a book called The Serengeti Rules, and that was very much about the science behind how we can sort of restore wildernesses and species, inspired by one of the great wildernesses in the world in Africa. And if you dig back, you can find some earlier books. There's a book I wrote called Remarkable Creatures, which is about really some of the pioneers of evolutionary science and the great adventures and voyages they went on to sort of discover the stuff that made us think how the world was put together. So all that is sort of driven by story. As a scientist trying to communicate, I'm really driven by story. Now that I just told you about the writing, you wouldn't know this part, but you can also find it on my personal website. I lead a science documentary studio as part of my work here. So we make films for the public that air on CNN and PBS, and one coming to HBO soon. And these are stories generally about science and nature. And this is just another way to communicate. Big collaborative process, work with filmmakers all over the globe to bring important and yes, deliberately chosen hopeful stories about how can we make this a better world. So, or sometimes they're just stories of great adventures and exploration. So we did a movie, for example, called The Farthest, which is about the Voyager missions to the outer solar system, and that was a blast. So films and books are the works that I'm going to leave behind.
Perfect. Awesome. That's what's going to make you a better ancestor every time. Every time you publish something, every time you write something, every time you direct something, you'll be one step to being a better ancestor.
Yeah, hopefully these are things that will stick around for a while and that people will find, worthwhile, worth digging into, and get something out of it that enriches their lives.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for talking to me and answering my questions and giving me your opinions. And I really appreciate you being here. And if I'm ever in your area, I will send you some tickets free of charge.
Pleasure, Sydney. Thanks so much.
Have a good day.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.